My dad and his wife would lock us out of the house for hours. And while they were inside getting high, my sister and I used to run around the yard, and I would tell my friends that when I grew up, I was going to move to the East Coast, go to Harvard, and be president of the United States. I find this childhood ambition kind of cute and funny now, given that no one in my family had yet graduated from college. And the most I knew of politics at the time was David Duke, being from Louisiana and all. But this dream would become my escape plan. So shortly after my 20th birthday, I packed everything I could into a single suitcase, and I maxed out my one credit card on a one-way plane ticket to Washington, D.C. In my mind, I had this all figured out. I was going to move to D.C., go to college, and work for NOW, the National Organization for Women. But as soon as I stepped foot off that plane, my reality became very different. I realized I was naive and completely unprepared because I hadn't found a place to live, and I hadn't gotten into any colleges because I hadn't applied. and I didn't have a job at NOW or anywhere else. I just had this dream. I managed to find a place to live in a group house on the outskirts of Capitol Hill, not a particularly safe place for a young woman at the time. I worked temp jobs, so I was always dead broke, and I struggled to pay my rent. One night I was over at my neighbor Alice's complaining to her about my life and how much it sucked and how I had no money and how I couldn't pay my bills. Now, in hindsight, Alice was not the best person to be giving me advice. She drank Bloody Marys for breakfast, and she cried throughout her day. But I remember what she said to me, and that was, she said, if I were young and cute like you, I would be an escort. She made it sound easy, like I'd go to some nice places, make some fast cash. How hard could it be? And the next thing I remember, Alice and I are sitting on the floor of her bedroom flipping through the escort ads in the back of the phone book. I dialed Pamela Martin and Associates, and a woman named Julia answered. But I know now Julia was Deborah Jean Palfrey, and Deborah Jean Palfrey was later called the DC Madam. She explained her rules. I had to be 24 with some college experience and go on a test run with one of her regulars. But before getting started, she required a photograph and a picture ID. It was about this time I explained to her that I was only 20 years old, but she said I sounded mature enough. So I sent her my photograph and an ID. She mailed me an entire book of guidelines. She stressed the importance of good hygiene and always having shaved legs, always dressing professionally, and always using a fake name. I picked Lily. And for 5 months, I worked as an escort for the DC Madam. It was only 5 months, but this time in my life felt like an eternity. Some nights I'd be lying next to my third John of the evening. My skin would crawl, my heart would ache. I'd end each night by numbing myself with whiskey and drugs. And over time, I began to feel broken. Like I couldn't be touched, I couldn't be looked at, and I definitely couldn't show up for work. And I remember I called Julia to tell her I was quitting, and I remember as I stood in the middle of my studio apartment staring at the dresser shoved into my closet as I told her I have to quit, I just do. Oh, I could tell she was super annoyed with me by the tone in her voice as she reminded me that the couple $100 that I had rolled up in my sock drawer wasn't going to last me long. And as I stood there staring at the dresser shoved into the closet, I kept thinking, how does she know? Because of course she was right. I quit working for Julia, but I kept drinking. Then one night, after a lot of vodka, whiskey, and pills, I landed in DC General Hospital for 7 days with an IV in my arm. After this, I realized if I didn't change my life, I was going to be dead by the time I was 22, and I attended my first 12-step recovery meeting. These meetings weren't easy for me. I remember I'd go in my pajamas, but I'd keep going. I got my first sober job as a checker at Safeway, and slowly, with the help of a lot of people who were once in my position, I managed to graduate college and then go on to serve in AmeriCorps. But I don't want to suggest that for even a moment that this was a clean upward trajectory. One time, my money was tight and bills were piling up again. I thought about going back to the DC Madam for fast cash. I'd even called and set up another appointment. But in the end, I decided that I didn't have the option of going backward. I had to continue moving forward. In early 2008, a year after I'm finally done with college and I'm finished serving in AmeriCorps, a friend of mine recommended me to a director on Capitol Hill by the name of David. David was looking to hire someone to answer phones in the office of Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. And I remember sitting in Senator Reid's front office in my black suit and pearls, desperately trying not to fidget. I was so nervous, and I knew landing this role would literally be a dream come true. A few minutes later, I'm sitting across from David, and he's doing the normal interview, and I guess I did a good job because in the end, he offered me a position, staff assistant. The salary was $28,000, and I took it. I literally lit up like a light bulb inside. I could barely contain my energy. I knew what this meant. This meant my life was on track. This meant I was progressing, and most importantly, this meant no one knew anything about my past. One day, I was working in the Reid office, and I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I decided I would Google myself, and I was shocked. It was a few years earlier that the D.C. madam had been arrested, and her phone records were now all online. And there I was, on the second page of results. My first name, last name, and old phone number. That was it, quite simple and lacking details. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I ran up to the 8th floor of the Hart Senate building, and I started pacing back and forth, calling anyone who I thought could help me cover this up. And while I was pacing, I kept thinking, how can something I did for 5 months when I was 20 years old still be haunting me? And more importantly, was it going to be there for the rest of my life? I became pretty consumed with this list. I started Google myself quite frequently, though I wouldn't click the link because I didn't want it to move up in the Google search. Every time I was called into a meeting, I expected the other shoe to drop. It'd be so easy for the other shoe to drop. It'd be so easy for someone to call me out on this. And I'd spent the last 6 years of my life working my way up from staff assistant to director of operations, and a friend calls and said he had just finished having lunch with an old colleague who was asking about a phone list. I tried to play dumb, and I quickly got off that call, and I called up the old colleague, and I was pissed. I was like, how dare you be talking about this? You have no idea. How do you know it's not a misprint, the wrong number, anything? You're spreading rumors. And as I accused him of this, I asked him, have you shared about this list with anyone else? Specifically, David. David, who I didn't work for anymore, but I still respected very much. And he said yes. I hung up that phone. I sprinted across 3 Senate buildings to the Hart building until I got to David's office, and I shut the door, and I said, I hear you know about the list. He said, what list? I said, the list. But the look on his face said, don't ask, don't tell. And feeling relieved that I wasn't going to have to give an explanation, I said, okay, never mind. I started to leave. But as I started to make my exit, David asked, well, since you brought it up, how did your name end up on that list? I started to cry as I told him a cleaned-up version of the truth. I basically lied. It's all I had to offer at the time. Not long after that conversation with David, I left the Hill. I felt like a failure, like my dreams were falling apart, like I couldn't hang. A couple years later, a couple jobs later, I landed at a law firm as a chief of staff, and I feel like, again, my life is progressing. Everything's on track. I'm making good money. What more could I want? And I had this nagging feeling that I wanted to be doing something more. And I got this idea. Maybe I could stop running and stop hiding and start using my experiences to help other women. But first, I knew I needed buy-in, so I started going back to the same colleagues I'd spent so many years trying to hide my secret from to tell them about my story and my idea to form an organization that supports vulnerable young women. I remember sitting at the Firehook Bakery on Connecticut Avenue talking to a former Reid colleague and friend, Rodell, about my idea to form this organization and about my story. And the look on his face said he had no idea this was my past. And as I connected the dots between my story and the organization, he offered and vowed to help me do anything he could to help me make it a success, but cautioned me that once this secret was out, there was no way I could put it back in. And though I wasn't 100% confident in my decision yet, I said I know. Because I kept thinking it was more important for me to start sharing about these experiences to help other women prevent them from going down the same path than to keep them inside. Since that conversation with Rodell, and in the last 15 months, her Resiliency Center has opened its doors and has served more than 70 young women, each with individual circumstances, to help them get on the path to a thriving future. Roll call. Roll call, a Capitol Hill newspaper recently did a front page feature about me. I would have gone with a different title than sex worker to Hill staffer. But it worked. It got people all over DC to read about my story and the work we do at my organization. I worked in a place where I felt like the only way I could look successful is to look as if my life were perfect. And each day I'd show up in my best suit and smile, and I would pretend. I know now that I spent way too much time running from my past, hoping that no one would find the truth and use it against me. It was a lot of work and a heavy burden to carry those secrets all these years, and it's been much more empowering to be able to own them. Thank you.